Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, from wherever you're joining us, and welcome to today's CODA Non-Invasive Blood Pressure Monitoring virtual demo. Before I welcome our speaker, David, to the floor here, I want to cover a few housekeeping notes to help you all get the most out of your experience today. First, take a look at the interactivity panel at the right of your screen with 4 tabs: Chat, Q&A, Polls, and Handouts. We want this to be an interactive experience for you, so please send your questions, thoughts, and comments using that Q&A tab, and we'll try to address as many of your questions as we can at the end of the demo today. When a question is added in that Q&A panel, you can upvote that question to increase its position on my list by clicking a thumbs up button underneath it. This is always helpful so I know which questions to address first. You can also explore some links and documents in the Handouts tab to learn more. And lastly, if you're having any technical issues, please try refreshing your browser and ensure you're using Google Chrome to access this event, as it is the most stable browser. If you're still having trouble after you try your refresh, use the private chat function to communicate with me by sending a chat to me, Sydney, and I can help to troubleshoot. And now I'm pleased to welcome David to the floor.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for this presentation on the CODA non-invasive blood pressure system. My name is David Poldiak, and I am the Director of Global Sales and Marketing at Kent Scientific. Thank you very much to Inside Scientific and Scientist.com for hosting this webinar. And most importantly, thank you for everybody who is attending for your time and attention. The CODA non-invasive blood pressure system is available in 2 options, and they're both pictured above. The CODA surgical monitor, or CODA monitor, is meant to monitor one rodent at a time. The system can be used on an anesthetized mouse or rat, or on a conscious, restrained mouse or rat with a specially designed holder. The CODA monitor includes an on-controller display, a touchscreen interface, and data can be saved directly to the device for exporting later. It can also interface with the CODA software for display, analysis, and management for use on a PC. The CODA high throughput, or CODA HT, which is shown to the right, is meant for simultaneous recording from multiple mice or rats. The system can be configured to record from 2, 4, 6, or 8 rodents at once. And even higher throughput, it can be configured to record from up to 48 if they're daisy chained together. All recorded signals and data are fed through the control unit to the CODA software. Pictured are the cuffs that are really arguably the most important part of the system. And so both CODA systems use an occlusion cuff, or what we call an O cuff, and a volume pressure recording cuff, or VPR cuff, to occlude and measure NIBP on the tail. The sequence of events for occlusion to measurement is as follows. The VPR cuff inflates to an inflation pressure of 250 millimeters of mercury. The O cuff does the same, inflates to 250 millimeters of mercury. And then the VPR deflates a little bit, but still maintains air in the latex bladder. And this is critical function and feature of the VPR cuff, and it's necessary to change or to detect any changes in the tail volume or tail size. At that point, the O cuff slowly and linearly deflates, and as blood returns to the tail, the first sign of the increasing of the tail size as detected by the VPR cuff is marked as the systolic point. The tail will continue to increase in size at an increasing rate, and when the tail continues to increase in size but changes to a decreasing rate, that's the point of the diastolic. That's where the diastolic point is taken, or the max DPDT, that inflection point or changeover point from increasing in rate and size to decreasing in rate and size. And then the increasing of the tail size causes a change in the calibrated voltage trace on the displayed graph to enable NIBP measurements. As the tail fully recovers, small pulses at the end of the recording cycle are counted as a heart rate. And this sequence of events repeats until the experiment is over. The CODA reports 4 physiologic parameters and 2 qualitative parameters. We previously talked about 3 of the 4 physiologic parameters as listed. And mean pressure is also reported once systolic and diastolic is recorded. We refer to tail blood volume and tail blood flow as qualitative parameters, as they are calculated and reported to help with the accepting or rejection of measurement cycles based on the software's built-in rejection criteria. And generally speaking, the higher the tail blood volume and tail blood flow, the higher the likelihood a measurement cycle will be accepted. What I'll show next is a video, and we'll pause it a couple of times through to make some comments on the setup and use of the CODA HT system.
Kent Scientific's non-invasive blood pressure systems accurately and safely measure systolic and diastolic blood pressure in mice and rats. The CODA tail cuff blood pressure systems utilize volume pressure recording sensor technology to measure the mouse or rat tail blood pressure. The CODA high-throughput system is cost-effective and requires no implant surgeries, yet still provides up to 99% correlation with telemetry and direct blood pressure measurements. The CODA high-throughput systems include an easy-to-use software interface. To set up your CODA system, install the software onto your computer or laptop. Connect the CODA controller to the computer using the included USB cable. The animals require a few minutes of acclimation time before taking blood pressure measurements. This acclimation is important to ensure proper tail blood flow and to reduce any effects of handling and restraint stress.
So I'll pause there for a moment. And acclimation is a common question that we receive, and we always get asked, what's the best way to acclimate your mice or rats? We recommend acclimating as much as possible, but we also realize that it may not be possible depending on the specific needs of the study. Placing mice or rats in the holder and allowing them to warm up on the far infrared platform is always recommended. And reaching and maintaining tail temperature is a critical component of setting up your experiment for success. Acclimation to the restrainers can also help reduce stress and improve results. Of the labs that acclimate their rodents to restrainers, they will do so for as long as 2 weeks prior to the first recording. Some labs will even place the restrainer in the home cage, that can be with or without the animal inside, or they'll remove the front and rear plates and place the cylinder piece in the cage, almost like a tunnel or a toy for something for the mouse or the rats to play with. In that case, you would want to make sure that the animal doesn't chew the restrainer piece. But ultimately, it's up to the lab to work within the confines of their animal use protocols, experiment needs, and skills of their technician, etc. And we realize that it's not always possible to be able to do some of these things. So the general rule is the longer that you can acclimate, generally the better the outcome. And also being consistent with your acclimation from study to study.
To save time, gently place your animals into the CODA holders and turn on the warming platform to acclimate the animals during the software setup process. Connect the occlusion and VPR cuffs to the controller by tightly securing the connectors on the front of the CODA system. Proper cuff placement is very important for accurate blood pressure readings. First, slide the occlusion cuff up the tail, just until you begin to feel some friction. The cuff should fit closely to the tail but should not be tight. The cuff doesn't need to reach the base of the tail. Fit is more important than the position. 2.
Pause again just to make a quick note about the fit of the cuffs. It is not uncommon when the study allows for it or the protocols allow for it to mark the tail of the mouse or the rat, particularly if you're going to record from that same one more than once. That is something that's commonly done, can help maintain consistency throughout your experiments.
2 different cuff sizes are provided with each cuff kit. Choose which size fits best, and be consistent in the size and placement across each of your animals. After the occlusion cuff is placed, slide the VPR cuff behind it. The VPR cuff should fit loosely. Once both cuffs are placed, cover the animals' tails with the warming blanket and turn on the CODA warming platform to level 3. Warming is a critical step, as tail temperature is directly correlated to tail blood flow. Now that the animals are acclimating, open the CODA software. Create or add to the list of users. Next, create a new experiment or add a session to an existing experiment. For this demonstration, we will create a new experimental protocol. This can be a protocol number or an experiment name. The CODA software will allow you to save your settings across each session of an experiment. This includes acclimation cycles, which are similar to practice, measurements before you start recording, and the number of regular cycles, which will be your data measurements. Kent Scientific recommends at least 5 acclimation cycles to allow for any adjustments that need to be made prior to data collection, and a minimum of 10 to 15 regular cycles per session. Deflation time is an important setting, as it affects the sensitivity of your measurements. Select a deflation time of 20 seconds if you are using mice or if your animals are anesthetized, and a deflation time of 15 seconds for conscious rats. Enter in the animals that will be used during the session. If desired, you can enter ear tag or other identifying features to separate your experimental groups.
And just a note about the acclimation cycles. So it is possible to accept those acclimation cycles as part of your results. The software does allow you to override the default settings of the acclimation cycles being excluded from your reports, and you can create reports with or without these cycles included. In some, and it's usually rare, but it does happen, the first 5 recordings may be the best recordings for that particular mouse or rat. And we give you the flexibility to choose which cycles you would like to report. Ultimately, it really depends on your institution, what your protocols are, how you expect to report data, but do know that you can override these acclimation cycles.
Now that the software is set up, verify that your animals have sufficient tail blood flow by measuring their tail temperature. Point the far infrared thermometer at the base of the tail. The tail temperatures should measure at least 32 to 35 Celsius to ensure optimal conditions. Once the tail temperature is in range, you can begin measurements. The first measurements are your acclimation cycles. If you need to make any adjustments, it is best to do so within this acclimation period. At the end of each blood pressure reading, the CODA software will display a graph for each animal. This graph is indicative of the signal strength of the reading and is helpful for troubleshooting. The red line represents occlusion cuff deflation, while the blue line represents VPR cuff pressure. As the occlusion cuff deflates, blood will flow back through the tail across the VPR cuff, which is represented by an upward curve in the blue line on the graph. Heart rate pulses are notated by short vertical lines and are measured towards the end of the cycle. Systolic and diastolic measurements are noted at the bottom of the graph. At the end of the session, the CODA software will offer options for data management. You may save a simple report for manual data analysis or a full report for software-calculated data analysis. The CODA software will also retain each of the graphs for every reading for later review. Kent Scientific's CODA.
So continuing on from the video, this slide is just showing another way to look at the graph and graph review. And the displayed graph is showing the occlusion cuff, which is in red, and then the VPR cuff, which is in blue. And the arrows are pointing to the systolic, diastolic, and heart rate point derivations, the heart rates with the circle. Again, that first sign of when the cuff starts to swell inside, or the tail starts to swell inside the VPR cuff, is taken as a systolic point. The changeover point in the rate of swelling with the green arrow is the diastolic point. And then the heart rate is taken over where the green circle is drawn. It's at the end of the cycle, and it assumes that the tail is recovered and it's pulsing each time the heart is beating against the inflated VPR cuff. With the CODA system, there's plenty of potential for where things can go wrong, because ultimately you're using a conscious restrained mouse or rat. So the right expectations and a lot of patience is needed. When you have an anesthetized mouse or rat, you take away the movement artifact and some of the stress response. But there are a few things that really keep in mind for obtaining optimal results. With that in mind, the CODA system has been used for 20 plus years, and there are thousands of publications that reference it. Number one, placement of the cuffs is very important, and it's an important first step in attaining optimal results. As shown in the video, the cuffs should not be too tight. It's also important to place cuffs on the tail as consistently as possible, meaning the location on the tail. It's not uncommon for the rodent to move the tail and shake the cuff down or shake it completely off. When this happens, the recording cycles can be paused, the cuffs can be placed and adjusted, and the recordings can continue. Second picture is shown to depict limiting environmental stress and noise. Recording data cycles away from noisy rooms, high traffic areas, biosafety cabinets that may come on and come off at different times, MRI machines, etc. And also maintaining the time of day, particularly in mornings, for consistency of when you are going to take your recordings is recommended. And then finally, and it's something that we really can't stress enough, being mindful of the tail temperatures. A tail temp between 32 to 35 Celsius provides you with the best chance of the tail overcoming the compression of the cuffs within the measurement cycle time frame. That's really the key to this system. The tail has to overcome that compression and swell to push against the VPR cuff. And really the importance of maintaining tail temperature and keeping tail temperature within that range, it cannot be overstated. It's also important to review the recording session settings as part of obtaining optimal results. The screen capture on the left shows part of the experiment wizard of the CODA software. The number of acclimation cycles, sets, recording cycles, deflation time, and minimum volume may be adjusted. For example, in some instances, allowing more time between cycles may help the tail to recover between each cycle or tail compression. However, increasing this value will mean that your experiments will take a little bit longer. And adjusting the min volume setting will directly affect the tail blood volume qualitative analysis feature, which means that more volume or a higher volume will be needed for the software to accept each measurement cycle. Of course, as the user, you can override this after the experiment during data review, if and when it's necessary. And it's also possible to pre-configure your end users, as in who's going to be using the software, and the animals that will be used on the study. The idea, if you can prepare beforehand, saves you a little bit of time when it's actually time to record. Here's an example of a mouse where the mouse is not moving, has a warm tail. It's very easy to calculate heart rate. If and when you're using the CODA system and your graphs look fairly consistent as this, you have a very good chance of getting a very clean and consistent recording. This is the case where just about everything goes right. And certainly this is a case where some things have gone wrong. And there are 3 examples shown below. So graph 1 on the left shows a small drop in both the O cuff signal and the VPR cuff signal. It's not enough to cause an invalid reading, but the end user should be aware of this. You should be keeping an eye on this. Could be possible that tightening the lower locks on the control unit and keeping an eye on the bladder conditions would be a good idea. And there's also some movement in the early part of the VPR cuff, which is shown with the blue arrow. The software has ignored this, and it's still able to calculate systolic and diastolic points. But you can see the heart rate is a little bit inconsistent. It's reporting a little bit low. So the user would have to, decide to accept or reject some or all of this recording cycle as part of their data analysis. Graph number 2 is something that commonly happens, particularly as someone that doesn't have a lot of experience using the system, or could be, very early on in the study. There's no VPR result here. This means that the tail did not overcome the compression of the cuff in the allotted measurement cycle time frame. It's likely the mouse or rat is too cold. In this instance, checking the tail temp with the infrared thermometer would be recommended. In the case of using the CODA monitor when you have an anesthetized rodent, it could be the effects of anesthesia. monitoring and delivering the least amount of anesthesia needed will help improve this result. And then finally, severely atherosclerotic rodents, very old rodents, or potentially other factors that really affect the ability of the mouse or rat to overcome the compression of the tail and return blood back to the tail could be an issue. In most cases, you should be able to use the CODA on a wide variety of rodents. However, sometimes it can be proved very difficult depending on what exactly is going on with them. Graph 3, this is a perfect example of a lot of tail movement where the blue arrow is pointing on the third graph. The software has rejected this cycle. The tail is moving all over the place. It's very difficult to get anything reliable when there's a lot of movement. This is one of the things why acclimation is so important and certainly helps reduce these occurrences. For the next part, I'll play another short video to look at troubleshooting channel leaks that kind of builds on some of these graphs that are seen.
Kent Scientific's CODA non-invasive blood pressure systems accurately and safely measure systolic and diastolic blood pressure in mice and rats. Regular bladder and cuff maintenance and identifying channel leaks will aid in increasing measurement accuracy and reproducibility between sessions. To get the most out of your CODA system, cuffs and bladders should be replaced regularly. Cuffs and bladders have a shelf life of about 1 year, and they can develop leaks over time. Age, frequency of use, and environmental factors such as temperature and humidity all affect the lifespan of the bladder material. Any leaks will negatively impact your results and could result in error messages within the CODA software. The graph displayed on both the CODA software and on the CODA monitor screen is indicative of the signal strength of the reading, but is also helpful for troubleshooting. The red line represents occlusion cuff deflation, while the blue line represents VPR cuff pressure. When the CODA software is run without animals, the red line should decline steadily, and the blue line should hold pressure. A VPR leak will cause the blue line on the graph to decrease significantly. When an O-cuff bladder has developed a leak, the red line on the graph will curve or sharply decline during the measurement cycle. An O-cuff leak can also cause a communications error in the CODA software. If you are testing cuffs using the CODA software, it is helpful to create a separate experiment folder specifically for cuff testing. Start a new session of cuff testing prior to moving forward with your data collection session. A small decline in pressure over each cycle is expected and indicates normal functionality, especially with larger cuffs. If you are testing rat cuffs, it is helpful to insert a pin or similar object through the VPR cuff to avoid overstretching or displacing the bladder. In addition to the pressure graph, the CODA monitor includes specialized tests that verify the pressure holding capacity of the cuffs and identify any leaks. Before beginning each session, use the full test, VPR test, and O-cuff test to verify that the cuffs are holding pressure. A failing cuff test result indicates that a leak has developed and that the bladder should be replaced. Degrading CODA bladders tend to develop a yellow color and a sticky or tacky feel. You may also notice that a degraded bladder can create a bubble or balloon out from the sides of the cuff during use. These are all indications that the bladders have degraded and need to be replaced. Proper cuff and bladder maintenance is a critical step in maintaining your CODA non-invasive blood pressure system. To extend the lifespan of your cuffs and bladders, store them in an airtight container away from excess heat, humidity, and light when your CODA system is not in use. We hope this video has been helpful for you. If you have
And just a note on the video with the maintenance of the cuffs. it's very good advice of what was said in the video. One thing too, after a year, it does not mean that your bladders will not work. I've certainly seen bladders work for a very long time. It really has to do with how often they're used and how well they're cared for. And testing before each the experiment of each day is really recommended and critical because it can help you identify leaks, whether those are leaks in you need to change the bladder, you have a cuff issue, or there's something wrong with the control unit. And it's always a good idea to test before that first experiment of the day. Once you do have some successful recordings, the CODA has really two reporting features. Summaries are created at the end of each experiment. A simple report can be sent to or copy and pasted in Excel or any spreadsheet program that accepts a standard text file. And then the CODA software also creates a more complete report with some basic statistics. It's possible to accept or reject the recording cycles within the CODA software offline and update either the CODA report or the simple output into your standard spreadsheet program like Excel. And this concludes the CODA NIBP presentation. For those who are familiar with the CODA, I hope this has served as a helpful reminder on some of the features and troubleshooting tips and why things are occurring the way they are. And for those who are new to the CODA system, I hope this has provided you with a detailed overview of what the system is capable of and the important factors to keep in mind when considering the addition of a CODA system in your laboratory. Thank you once again for your time and attention.
Thank you for that fantastic demo, David. I'm going to let you catch your breath a little bit while I run some polls before our Q&A session. So I'll give you a moment here. All right. Before I jump into the polls, though, I wanted to pop up this link for everyone for an upcoming webinar sponsored by Kent Scientific on March 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern. If you'd like to read more and register, please click that link and sign up. We would love to have you join us. All right, so I'm going to run a few polls for everyone before we jump into our Q&A session. So our first one here. What animal models do you typically work with? So please submit your response. Your options here are mouse, rat, or other. So please select the one that best relates for you in your research. And we really appreciate you all taking the time to respond. Fantastic. I see lots of responses coming in. All right. I'm going to launch our second poll here. What type of rodent blood pressure monitoring system have you used in the past, if you've used any in the past? So your options for this one are invasive or non-invasive. Let's see responses coming in for that one as well. Fantastic. Okay, just a couple more. Our next one here. Would your studies or outcomes benefit from monitoring blood pressure during surgical procedures? So please let us know yes or no. While you're answering those, I did want to draw your attention back to that handouts tab. There are some great resources in there to help you learn more about the CODA system that David presented today. All right. Amazing. Okay, so our very last poll. Appreciate you all again participating in these. Do you work with individual animals or do your studies require high throughput capability? So let us know whether you work with individual or multiple high throughput. Thank you so much. Okay. And one last thing before we bring David back in. If you do have to leave early, I wanted to ask you all to please participate and take a moment to give your feedback in the survey that's popped up there on the bottom left corner of your screen. We really appreciate all of your insights. All right. David, I'm going to welcome you back now. Hello again. All right, let's jump into our Q&A session now. I think we have already got lots of questions. Let me see. Okay, I'm going to also flip back to this slide here. So if anyone does need to leave, they do have your contact information that they can reach out to you. Okay, our first question from April. What is the lowest recorded MAP you're able to obtain? MAP.
Good question. I don't know the answer offhand. It would just have to be somewhere. If your diastolic is down into the 50s or even 40s, that's about as low as I've seen. I'm just kind of calling on experience. It's probably something that I'll need to check on the range of the transducer. But then it would really depend on how low that would go. Yeah, I'd have to follow up with you about that. You stumped me on the first one.
Hey, that's a great way to get started.
Yeah, I mean, just as an example, from a standpoint of when the mouse is under anesthesia, seeing systolics in the range of 80, even low 70s, and diastolics down into the low 50s and high 40s is possible. So that would put your mean somewhere in the middle of those. But I'm not sure if there is a low limit on the diastolic. I'll need to check on that. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. Our next question from Noah. Can you repeat the information on the minimum tail volume adjustment and how that influences the results?
Sure. So when the system was developed, the idea with the volume and the flow was you put a balloon that was used in isolated heart experiments, and you inflate it to 20 cc's, and you increase the size per volume, and then it correlates the pressure changes. So as the tail starts to swell, you're hoping to see the tail swell a significant amount. When over time we've kind of come to some hard number values that have worked into the algorithm to help qualify the data. So ideally, the more the tail swells or returns to form, the higher that volume will be or correlate to, and the higher the flow will be, and the more likely is that your cycle would be acceptable. If you only see a small movement in the tail volume, it probably means that the tail has not recovered enough or quickly enough to get any sort of reasonable systolic or diastolic pressure. And that would mean that your VPR line is very, very flat. So you want to see a decent amount of displacement with that VPR line to show that your tail has recovered.
All right, great response. Thanks. We have a couple of questions regarding tail injuries. Can you expand on whether you've seen any, the risk of, for example, tail degloving specifically?
Yeah, it's not common. It's not commonly reported, and that could be a function of our customers are not telling us about it. And keep in mind, the system's been available in some way, shape, or form for 20 plus years, or it's not happening very often. You do have to be careful with the warming pads, the far infrared pads, to make sure that you have an appropriate heat setting. But as far as damage to the tail due to the cuffs, it's not commonly reported. I mean, I've been with Kent now for ongoing 5 years, and I don't remember a customer reporting to me directly about that, especially my other colleagues too.
Okay, appreciate that. Should be good news. All right, Alan has asked, how are tail blood flow / volume values used to accept or reject a reading? Are there threshold values?
Yeah. So in the slide, and I assume everyone can still see the
Yes,
slide
they
here.
can. Thanks.
There is a minimum volume setting that's predetermined, and you can adjust that too. And I alluded to this a little bit in the presentation. The higher the displacement, which is along this line, generally the better the signal will be. So if I look, I'm trying to find another graph. This is the part where the tail is swelling. It's increasing in size. Well, no, it's overcoming the compression of the cuffs. And if it was very, very small, it may not displace enough to be detected as an event. And that would be determined by this setting in the software. And here's an example of almost no displacement, this flat line.
Great. Okay. Thanks for showing that, David. Okay. Our next question from Melissa is asking, what is the best way to clean bladders/cuffs between animals before storing?
You do have to be careful with that. Just wiping it down, really. If there's a lot of waste that's produced, we would not really recommend to clean them with like soap and water or anything like that. If they're really, really messy, we'd recommend changing the bladders and potentially the O-rings. But remember, you are working with latex. The other substances that you introduce can eventually break down the latex, and you would need to change them anyway.
All right, perfect.
And one point to that, there's plenty of labs that'll use the same. Let's say they have an 8-channel system or a 6-channel system or 4-channel system. They'll reuse the cuffs on their animals and change when necessary. Others will buy specific cuffs for specific animals. It's a more expensive way to do it, but that is, that's another idea.
Okay, great. Audrey asks whether the black platform where the tunnels are placed heat up.
Yeah, so the platform that's shown actually both platforms. So this for the high throughput is a far infrared warming platform. And this is a far infrared warming platform that is more like that attaches to the CODA monitor and is more like a soft surgical platform. This it's a V-shaped channel to hold the holders in place. And then the tails come out and rest in the V shape of the far infrared warming. And then this is adjustable too. There's 6 different warming settings. Generally, warming setting 3 or 4 is most common. The lower settings, if your room is very warm for some reason, can be used. The higher settings, meaning 5 or 6, usually depends on environmental factors, like a very cold room or something to where the mice really just have trouble warming to 32 to 35 on their tails.
All right, that's fantastic. Thank you for the information. Okay, our next question from Yeking. Do you still need to place the animal within the strainer if it's under ISO? So if it's under anesthesia?
No, it's typically not necessary.
Okay, great. Irene's question, how can you tell if a leak or issue is due to a problem with the bladder versus the cuff versus the controller itself?
Mm-hmm. So this is just kind of a process of elimination and isolating each component of the system when testing. If you have the problem with the control unit, if you cap all the channels on the control unit and you don't have any cuffs attached to it and you run a measurement cycle, if there's a leak, you'll see a change in either the red or blue lines. And so instead of holding pressure where this would have a steady decrease and this would be holding fairly steady, meaning the blue line, if you have an occlusion cuff problem, this will drop, the red line. If you have a VPR cuff problem or leak, meaning on that channel, this will drop. So that's a way to determine if the control unit has gone bad. With the cuffs, if you have a problem with the cuff, one of the things that you can do is use a known working cuff, one of the cuffs that will hold pressure, and put it on a different channel and see if you get the same result. And you can isolate the cuff that way. Then before doing so, or if you isolate that you potentially have a cuff problem, then you change the bladder. If the bladder doesn't solve anything, it might be a cuff issue. You can also squeeze the tubing. From the point that you squeeze the tubing going back into the control module, that will show if there's a problem at any point between the squeeze point back to the control module. So it's really a process of elimination, trying to determine which is where the leak is occurring.
Fantastic. And then, of course, your team's available for support should there be any further questions about their system.
That's correct. Yeah, email, phone, video chat, even on-site visits while the team is out in the field.
Wonderful. Okay. Our next question from Ben is asking about the significant importance specifically of the VPR technology. They want to know why not just the occlusion cuff.
The VPR technology was really developed to give another way to qualitatively assess the cycle, the recording cycle. So again, it was an idea to measure the displacement of the increasing in size of the tail once it's been compressed, and to put some numbers behind it so you could accept or reject within the algorithm of the software.
All right, that's great.
In some of it too, I mean, a loose correlation. If you think of the occlusion cuff as kind of like the cuff that you would have on your arm, and the VPR is similar to a stethoscope.
I think that's a good analogy, and hopefully that answered their question. Okay, we do have a few more minutes. I just want to let people know to continue to submit your questions. We can't get to all of them today, but I will be passing this on to David and the Kent Scientific team. So yeah, please continue to submit them or reach out to David directly if you have a specific question for him. Bart's question is asking if you can comment on MR compatibility of the system. Is there a performance difference with a long line? Obviously, anesthesia comes into play here as well.
Yeah. There is a MRI compatible. Well, the cuffs are MRI compatible. There's no metal in there. And then running lines of several feet have not shown a signal degradation. I'm sure at some point there would be some signal degradation. We just really haven't run into it yet. And about the longest that I've seen is about 7 or 8 feet in the tubing. And so hopefully that is enough to satisfy your MRI needs from wherever your recording station would be.
Okay. Thank you. All right, our next question from Zuzana. Can I analyze the data also by myself, not only generated results from the system?
So you can't export like the raw graphs and recreate those like a voltage trace. You can take the reported data and you can accept or reject each of the cycles that you record. So that's one thing you can do, and that can be done. You just export to Excel and reject in Excel or whatever spreadsheet program you use. You can do so using the CODA software and then export the updated graph or the updated results, sorry. And then generally speaking, especially when someone's newer, I would recommend looking at the graphs and looking at an Excel sheet and kind of comparing the two. I think the interface works well using that methodology, and seeing what has been accepted, what's been rejected, and then doing developing some of your own criteria for that analysis. If you were looking to take like the raw voltage trace data and sort of rerun algorithms, that is not possible in the current version.
Okay, thank you. Our next question from Jun Zhang is asking if it's possible to measure blood pressure in 4 to 5 weeks old mice, so small.
About how much would they weigh? Because I'm not sure off of my head as far as their weights. Is about as small as you can go is around 12 grams, give or take.
Okay. Hopefully that answers things. Obviously, if you have a very specific weight or a specific model that you have questions about, please reach out to the team. They'll be more than happy to help you answer your specific research questions. All right. I think I can squeeze in one or two more of these questions. Noah is asking if there's a difference of approach for using hypertensive model animals. They saw significant stress induced despite providing acclimation.
Mm-hmm. That is true. There's not. It's not always possible to have a mouse or a rat reduce stress even with acclimation, and sometimes they're just not going to cooperate on certain days. The hope is that you're thorough and you're consistent with your acclimation approach, and then when it's time for the study, that you're thorough and consistent about what you are, how you're prepping your animals, and then at that point, it's will they cooperate? And that isn't always the case. Sometimes there's other stressors that are involved, and it's not certainly it's not a perfect a perfect acclimation. What's the word I'm looking for? Sort of a perfect acclimation setup or system every time that you use it. Sometimes animals just will not cooperate. And then, depending on the key, as far as taking measurements, if the rodent's tail swells, you should get a measurement. That's number one. And then it's a matter of, exactly when is it occurring, and if it is, a hypertensive animal is stressed and it's showing, either more than expected hypertension or hypertension because of the stress or because it's really hypertensive. Sometimes it's hard to tell.
Yes. Okay. Great. Thank you. All right. Let's just squeeze in this very last question here. We are a little bit over time. We appreciate everyone staying. Audrey's asking if you think that the acclimatization time is more for the mouse to stay in the tube, or if it's to support / endure the cuff on the tail. She's heard 2 weeks, maybe once a day.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. The acclimation for the restrainer is a little bit easier because you're not tied to using the cuffs, and that ideally reduces the stress when the mouse or the rat goes into the restrainer. The cuffs, it's a little harder to acclimate. Some people will put the mouse or rats in the restrainers, put them on the platform, put the cuffs on, run some cycles, may or may not collect the data, or accept the data as part of their study. There's a lot of different ways to do it. Certainly, there's no perfect way. If you find doing that works best for you, by all means, and we can't say that it's a bad way to do it. I don't know if there's been any particular studies comparing, saying, if you acclimate restrainer only versus, say, restrainer and cuffs, if it's made a significant difference. I don't know if they exist.
All right. Thanks for that response, David. I am going to make that the last question. So I just want to thank you again for your time and your expertise today. It was such a pleasure to have you with us, and I hope you enjoyed yourself.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, and thanks again for everybody who attended.
Great. Okay, I want to thank you, our live audience, as well. We know that you have busy schedules, so we really appreciate you being here live, and I hope that you enjoyed your experience today. In closing, we hope you enjoyed this Inside Scientific virtual demo produced in partnership with Kent Scientific, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.